want to welcome folks to CWI's Spotlight series on Sunday. Here we are. We're broadcasting from Los Angeles, meaning we are all in Los Angeles, that being our amazing colleague, Zach Ritter. And I'm Joe Brooks, CWI director and founder. And just a bit of information on Community Works Institute, CWI. We're very much focused and have been for the last 25 years. This is our 25th anniversary. We're really thrilled by that, to work with educators and students around the country and around the world focused on connecting students to the community. That's what we're about. And we do a lot of teacher training institutes. We have a winter institute coming up. We hope you'll check our website out, communityworksinstitute.org. And that's coming up at the end of January 28th through 30th, and then 2 summer institutes, one in July and one in August. And we also work individually with schools as well. I want to introduce my illustrious colleague, Zach Ritter, who I've done some amazing work with over the last year. He's just a pleasure to know and work with, my friend and colleague. He too is here in Los Angeles. Zach teaches, he's a professor, teaches social justice courses at UCLA and a number of other universities in the Los Angeles area. And he's the assistant Dean of Student Life at Cal State Dominguez Hills, which is a relatively high needs, pretty first generational focused university. And so Zach carries a lot of important work down there, supporting those students to see that they, make it through, get their degree and succeed in life. And I just have great admiration for the work he does. He also consults with schools and has consulted with educators both through our summer institutes and on his own around the United States, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and always social justice. And not enough space and time here for Zach to tell his story. I did do a session with Zach in the Spotlight series. It's, as this will be available on CWI's YouTube channel. You can find that off our main website or search YouTube for Community Works Institute. And there's a great recording of Zach unpacks some of his own personal history, which is interesting, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to welcome Daedra Staten, another amazing educator based here in Los Angeles. And Zach, I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself and then bring Daedra forward into the conversation so we can get to know her. Thanks to you both for being with us today.
Well, you just made my whole day. I'm illustrious. That's a big deal. That is a big deal. You're the best hype man. I appreciate you.
Whoa, what do you mean by
that? Let's see if I could do a favor to Daedra. Well, yes, what Joe said, I'm an educator and I do diversity consulting work, and I got interested in interviewing my friends who are doing amazing things in their life and with their, through a critical race lens and a critical class lens and gender lens. Daedra and I became good friends and now colleagues. So you are a lawyer, you are a recruiter, you are a diversity consultant, you go hard on folks on the Instagrams, and you're an educator all around, and I appreciate you. And I want you to kind of be able to give your own more solid introduction. And so tell folks, who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. This is going to be fun, I hope. So what do? I wear a lot of different hats. So I have worked at UCLA, which I just formally left, but I'm still involved. I'm still in the mix. I can never actually get free of UCLA, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I worked there for 7 years following law school. I went to law school at UCLA, where I did the critical race studies program and kind of concentration in international and comparative law as well. So hyper focused on the really uplifting topics of genocide and racism and identity formation, international relations with a legal, kind of spin to it. After that, I became a fellow at UCLA. I was there for about 1.5 years, then left and went and worked at a nonprofit serving underserved communities, largely Black and Brown students and families in the greater LA area for about a year, and then back to UCLA. Doing lots of diversity recruitment and outreach, student services, so helping students to really adjust. Most of my students are international students, 35 different countries represented, and I hand recruit a lot of them. So as Zach, you know this, but I'm sure our viewers do not. I'm out of the country typically 3 or 4 months out of the year, bouncing all over the place. I was out of the country when COVID began and had to, skedaddle back to the United States very quickly. So just lots of diversity recruitment, lots of interacting with diverse students and diverse families. I do work with the State Department, going to different Education USA fairs and conferences all over the world. So that's the UCLA side of things. So now in this next chapter, this new phase, I launched a diversity consultancy this past July, which feels like 27 years ago now. COVID brain, but doing lots of consulting for educational institutions, for nonprofits, for organizations really big and small. And it has ranged from, doing things that I never thought I would be doing, like diversity mediation and kind of crisis consulting, to the more typical trainings, workshops, one-on-one diversity consulting sort of thing. So kind of all over the map in a good way with respect to the diversity consulting activities, and it just keeps growing. So that's me in a very quick 1 minute or less nutshell.
No, I love it. Thank you for sharing that. So take us back. I still need to give you your book back about the Congolese genocide. And we get into these conversations about those 6 million Jewish folks, in the Holocaust, and we nerd out about comparative genocide and Samantha Power, and then you gave me this book. What is it? Dancing in
the Glory of Monsters. Yeah.
Monsters, and it talks about the 6 million folks basically genocided in the Congo. But so take me back to where did this interest in social justice start? And were there any aha moments during your K through 12 experience? Because there's a lot of K through 12 educators on the call. And I know whenever I visit your home, there's books stacked on stacks on stacks. And I love it. So we nerd out about that. So tell me about that.
Yeah, I joke that if there's an earthquake in LA, I'm just gonna die. They're gonna find me under a pile of books. But yeah, so there have been a number of instrumental moments K through 12. I think I've told you this before, but my mom definitely thought I was a bizarre child because you have those book fairs at school where you your parents would give you $20 and go buy some books or whatever. And I would always come home with just Holocaust books for some reason as a 7 or 8 year old. My mom was just what do you do? What are you doing? This is great. I'm glad you want to read, but why? So it started young. It started very early. And I'm guessing that was kind of rooted in my own recognition of difference. I grew up in suburban Philly, about 40 minutes outside of Philly, outside of the city, this little town called Pottstown. And, there were Black and Puerto Rican people there, but it was a very white suburb, very, very white. I'm biracial. I identify as Black, but Black biracial. My mom is white. My dad's Black. I have a brother, also biracial, same parents biologically. And I didn't realize until I was about 5 or 6 years old. I remember I was in school. It was kindergarten or first grade, that I was actually different than other people. I kind of just thought there was this random lottery where it was who cares what your parents look like? You just pop out looking whatever. It's just a thing that happens. And I realized when my dad came to pick me up from school, one of my friends who was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white girl, who I'm still friends with to this day, she was wait, your dad's Black? And I turned and looked at her. I was yours isn't? What do you, what? I didn't get it up until that point that there's a predictive capacity to what you would look like based on your parents. And I think that really kind of pushed me to start interrogating race and my positionality in the world and kind of the way that I was looked at and treated. I hadn't realized that I was looked at differently until that point. And I think it kind of just sent me on this, what has turned into a lifelong journey of investigating race, identity, and the links to things like genocide and, just terrible treatment of humans as long as we've existed on this planet.
Yeah, and I feel whenever we have these conversations, there's this kind of feeling of responsibility that if we know this history and we have these lived experiences, that we're supposed to do something with that knowledge. And whenever you tell me stories about your workplace and like who you work with, is like you're rubbing shoulders with some like the biggest scholars in like critical race theory and just like in law, like thinking. Do you feel like, well, tell us a little bit about your, experience at UCLA, and also rubbing shoulders with these really dynamic scholars. What are some of the lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, so rubbing shoulders with the giants, like really, it's kind of amazing. I had no idea what I was like falling into when I went to UCLA Law. Like I didn't know what the critical race studies program was until I got to UCLA Law. My experience, it's interesting. It's two things. It's like they are these real life giants, like the things that these people have done. I mean, so just to name drop a little bit, I was very, very lucky my first year at UCLA. So as a law student, you get thrown into the same core classes as everyone. You have to take contracts, you have to take property, you have to take constitutional law. And I was one of 9 Black law students in a class of 300, which is insane. And they decided to kind of like form a critical mass of us by putting, like 4 or 5 in one section and 4 or 5 in the other, so that at least we'd like have each other, right? And so I had the experience of, walking through the law school like that, and also having Cheryl Harris as my constitutional law professor, right? So Cheryl Harris is one of the OGs of critical race studies. She is a heavy hitter in civil rights law and employment law. She helped South Africa draft their constitution after apartheid. Like this woman is just, like she's it. And she was my constitutional law professor. So she was really foundational in how I came to think about not just the law, but also race and the law, and myself, honestly, my own identity as a woman of color, as a light-skinned woman of color with privilege, both socioeconomically, skin color-wise, educationally. And so it's interesting, there are these giants, and that was my experience, but they're also these like normal people. I'd have these weird experiences where like I was on a raw food diet for a while in law school, and like Cheryl Harris like comes up to me in the hallway and is like, like I heard from Devin Carvato, this like other big CRS professor, you're on this diet, like what's up? Like what do you like? We see you with these huge things of juice. So it's just like really weird to like, have these like experiences where like Cheryl Harris is like unpacking the entire history of like racial segregation in the United States, like back to like, pre-slavery era. And then she's like, what's this juice you're drinking? Like, what's this diet you're on, right? So it's this very both humbling and also like normalizing experience in like a really, really strange way, right? And I had like a lot of experiences like that. Kim Crenshaw was, like the founder of like, intersectionality theory, or like at least the one who coined the term. She was my professor for both civil rights law. I also had her for a transnational critical race theory clinic. And we went to Colombia, the country, for 2 weeks together. And, I'm like riding around in cars in Colombia with Kim Crenshaw. So it was just interesting because, they are these people who are just beasts. They're giants. You look up to them, but they're also like normal humans that like, do the same things we do. So it was cool. It was interesting, super formative. Yeah.
It's amazing. That's amazing. So going back to your first kind of statement, were there moments in your childhood, right? You're talking about this little girl who's like, oh, like, yeah, my dad's not Black. And you have this like aha moment. Were there weird racialized moments growing up where you're like, yeah, like this is different?
Got so many. So many. So I mean, you see this hair, right? So this has been like one of the defining things in my life, and it's always been big. It's winter right now, so you can't really see it, but I have a lot of blonde streaks in my hair. When I was little, my hair would look like bleach blonde. In the summer, I was on the swim team. I was always outside. So, I'm like this little really tan, like biracial Black girl running around with like these like wild blonde hair. And I would get it from both sides, right? Like I would get your hair texture is funny, like, or looks weird from my white friends. And then I would be told like I wasn't Black essentially from like a lot of, Black little kids, which like there was no space that was mine to have racially speaking. I was in this category all its own and no one else was really in it. One of the weird things about Pennsylvania, despite the fact that Philly and even like Pittsburgh and some of the other bigger cities are pretty racially diverse, they're very segregated still to this day. So even though I grew up with a lot of Black kids, a lot of Puerto Rican kids, specifically a lot of Italian kids who still like identify as like Italian, it was segregated. I only knew one other biracial or mixed kid growing up. There was not a lot of in between Black and white. Like there wasn't a lot of in between like white and Puerto Rican or Black and Puerto Rican, right? Like you were this one thing, you had your community and your cultural and religious and ethnic, stuff over here. And it didn't really intermix. Like we all went to school together, we played sports together, whatever, but like we didn't marry one another. Like we weren't having kids together, right? So like we were a weird family and I was like a weird kid in a lot of ways. Like you had this, socioeconomically like upper middle class mixed family of a Black man who, my dad worked for IBM, a white woman who's, the public school teacher at like a really well-known school. And then these like weird looking little biracial kids running around. And we were the only ones really. So that was pointed out consistently and frequently from a very, very young age. And it definitely impacted the way that I moved through the world and the things that I thought about and would bring to the surface. I mean, I was always talking about race, like always from a very young age, talking about difference. It affected things like going to sleepovers. I never wanted to stay the night. Like I'd get ready to go to a sleepover. I get like my sleeping bag, take the pillow, and I'd call my dad at like 12 o'clock, 1 a.m. every time to come pick me up. And I just put words to this recently. I'm pretty sure it was because of my hair. Like I had all these hair products and my hair would look like wild when I woke up in the morning. And like, I'd put like, I had oil in my hair, like whatever, and it would get on pillowcases. And like, that wasn't something that white girls, most of my friends growing up were white girls, would have to deal with. And, people already made fun of my hair. So it did really impact just normal childhood experiences, like not wanting to spend the night, right? Because I didn't want my hair to be further ridiculed. I didn't want to have to deal with it. So yeah, it was it was a lot growing up, being biracial, being Black in this specific space that I grew up in.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting visuals and just like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of trauma in there too. I mean, I think when you talk about it, you maybe because you've told the story before, it's like lighthearted and fun, but underneath that, I'm sure there's trauma there that I think you alluded to in the COVID time. There's a lot of unpacking that's going on.
There is. And I mean, we've talked about this before. There's definitely trauma. I know I speak about it lightheartedly because I get asked about it so much. I think I'm frequently one of the only biracial Black people that has like natural hair that is unapologetically Black that people interact with, right? And I'm in a lot of white spaces. I, went to undergrad at USC, which is like very white, very wealthy, very Jewish. Like there's like a lot of, different representations of whiteness at USC. UCLA law, right? Like law schools are still very white and very male dominated in thought, even if not by like actual representation numbers. So like I've had to tell these stories a lot of times. But I also think the other thing is I learned from a young age, I had to learn how to navigate this myself. My parents did the best they could, but we did not talk about race. Which my brother and I have an older brother, he's 4.5 years older than me. And he's working with me on some of the consulting stuff and some of the diversity things. And we've had these conversations frequently. We actually had a sit down with my dad a couple of months ago because my mom was like, David, you have to go down there and talk to them about this. Like, we haven't done a good enough job about like, talking to our kids about race. So like my mom literally like dispatched my like 74-year-old father like down here to have this conversation with us. And it was really this like heartfelt, like, but awkward. I could tell it was awkward for my dad. He felt guilty, I think, about not having really engaged with us in these topics growing up. We didn't talk about race, and we were having real feelings about race, obviously, as these two biracial Black kids growing up. And so I think learning to walk through the world, having to figure it out yourself, makes one talk about it in a specific way. And for me, that's lightheartedness. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to get through it and be able to have these conversations over and over and over again without it doing like real damage to me being able to communicate, right? You know, I figured out how to compartmentalize it and talk about it and survive, I guess, essentially, if that makes sense.
How to survive. Yes. Yeah. And I don't, you don't need to go into it all, but the conversations we've had about your father's racial identities, like very interesting. And it just brings up a lot of stuff about generational stuff and what it meant to be Black then and what it means to be Black now. And almost not wanting to pass on the trauma to your child, but knowing that it's going to happen anyway.
I definitely think that's where my parents, both of them, are coming from. I mean, my parents met in Washington, D.C., which is like very Black city, you know, relatively in the United States. They met in the 60s. You know, you have to think about things like my, you know, white mom, Black dad, miscegenation, anti-miscegenation laws, right? Like anti-mixing laws, Black people and white people marrying one another applied to other racial groups as well. But they were still on the books like around the time when my parents met. And, you know, when they got married, I think they got married in Maryland. You know, that state had just like gotten rid of that law like 3 or 4 years prior, maybe 5, if we're being like generous. So
the big case, right? Loving versus Virginia.
Yeah, Loving versus Virginia, right? Like that was like, you know, my dad's 74, my mom just turned 70. So like that was like they were alive, well, like knew what was going on. This was their life, right? And my dad came from like a pretty Southern Black family, super Southern Virginia, like little tiny town called Emporia, Virginia, like right before you get to North Carolina. My mom is from the Midwest. I was born in Wisconsin. I was born in Madison. So like opposite, you know, spheres, completely different worlds. On my mom's side, we're, you know, Swedish, Austrian, like Germanic people. And like, you know, you have my dad's side, which are like literally like descendants of slaves in the United States from the South. And so like there was this like the histories that they brought together and also their own history that they created, being this, you know, multiracial, interracial couple at that time period, right? Just after the Vietnam War, which my dad was in, you know, just after anti-miscegenation laws were getting swiped from the books. It was, I think it really impacted them. And I think it was traumatic for both of them. And I don't think they wanted us to have to deal with that. And it's come out, you know, with all the insanity in the past few years, politically, racially, et cetera, in the United States and elsewhere, it has come out. You know, my mom cried when the election went the way it did in 2016, not necessarily out of anger about who was elected, but out of sadness because she felt like what she had fought for her whole life as a woman, as a feminist, as a woman who had Black kids, she felt like it wasn't going to come to fruition, the world that she dreamed of for us, right? And I think she started rethinking kind of the steps she had taken and the belief she had put in us as a country to do the right thing and create the space that we always said we would, right? So yeah, I think it did a lot of damage to them. And I think they thought they were preventing us from being damaged by not talking about it, right? Not talking about the damage, not talking about the trauma, not talking about the pain and the, you know, awkward and potentially harmful situations that they had been in. So yeah, it's, it's a lot to unpack. We could do like a whole, you know, thing on just that.
No, there's a lot there. I mean, yeah, parental goodness and trauma that's passed down, but also this idea of a vision that your parents had for you, or a vision that they had for the world that maybe didn't come to fruition, is still coming to fruition. Tell us about, you know, your experience in law school and now working at that same law school. It seems like you are still trying to build that vision, I think, with you know, your students that you recruit, but also the critical race theory, justice-centered legal stuff that you were learning. Tell us about, you know, law school and recruiting.
Yeah. So first, the law school piece. I mean, I was so lucky to fall into the program, the critical race studies program, accidentally, right? Having Cheryl Harris as my con law professor and hearing the things that I would say in class, she basically pulled me aside and was like, you need to check the critical race studies program out. Like, you clearly care about these issues. And I hadn't thought about it. I was just like, I hadn't really thought about anything other than international law, right? Because that's my background. I studied international relations and philosophy of law in undergrad. I went and lived in South Africa for a little bit. And like, that was really like my focal point. And like the race was definitely there, right? Like both personally and as part of like my worldview at that point, having lived in South Africa, like as someone who they identified as colored, right? Like race was in everything. But I hadn't thought about like a serious academic undertaking in the race or identity world. And then I had this experience with her as my professor and she was like, go check this out. I did. And I was like, you know, thank whoever, whatever higher power you believe in, that this happened. Because it really gave me this sense of like calm and belonging that I had never experienced before. There was this community of not only like-minded people, but like seriously suspicious people with respect to our institutions and the narrative we'd been fed our whole lives. And it gave us this shared terminology and like a language almost, right? To like talk about the experiences that all of us had had, these marginalized, minoritized, oppressive experiences that all of us had shared. And, you know, America does a really good job, I think, at like gaslighting people of color and minorities, and telling us like, oh, that's not racism, like, you know, that's this other thing, or like, it's nothing at all, or, you know, whatever. And having not only this shared language, but also like getting to like figure out, like to dig a little bit and be like, oh, that was an intentional racial project that like the government did like on purpose, right? And like having words, having a structure, having like data, right? Like having some facts to engage in these conversations and write about these things with, and being able to like connect the dots. It was so incredibly powerful for me. And I think for pretty much everyone else in that program. So like that was law school for me. It was these amazing professors. It was, you know, the Cheryl Harrises, the Devin Carbatos, the Kim Crenshaws, the Asla Balis, who like, she's this just amazing like behemoth in the field as well, like look her up. You know, just these amazing professors. And it's so interesting. I felt like I was institutionally like reforming from the inside in a lot of ways, just by like existing in the space. There weren't a lot of people who looked like me, and also studying critical race studies within a law school is like, it feels like you are just like pushing outward from within, because it is a very old, very white structure that is rooted in these things I was just talking about, right? Systemic and structural racism, protection of property rights. That's what this country is founded on, right? Whiteness, maleness, property in both humans, slaves, and actual land, right? And stealing land theft from indigenous peoples. So it was fascinating to be in this institution that had created those people who had built and protected the very thing that I was fighting against. Was just kind of mind-blowing to me, and still is. And how does that translate like into the recruitment piece, right? So it's interesting. When I first started recruiting,
here's this place that created all this terrible ish, and now please come.
Well, because here's the thing, like, what is the skill set that I was given? Like I just said, like this also created like the first home I really ever had, intellectually and as a person of color. There were people who looked like me, people who were as serious as I am about interrogating these systems. And I really believe that like the best way like to fix this situation, to fix this problem, is to like get up in those institutions and like do the work, right? And I know that there's problems of equity and access involved in that. And that's part of why the recruitment piece is so important to me. Like it is so like just so important to have people that look different and who have accents and who have different lived experiences, who are coming from, you know, Indonesia or from Mongolia. Like I went and recruited in Mongolia. Like what, like just, you know, trying to like get these students to come to this institution, this very white, this very historically male institution, and shake things up, and also be, you know, a representative of the institution that doesn't look like what people expect an attorney from a top 15 law school to look like, right? They're not thinking me. They're not thinking the, you know, Japanese guy or even the French woman, right? They're expecting a white male person. And I think it's so important to put something other than that out into the world and to bring something other than that into the law school to really change what the law school is, what it does, and what it means. So that's, I guess, kind of how I think about the recruitment piece and like why it was so important to me, is really like doing the work to diversify, right? And to make the law school actually inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. So let's jump into it then. Now you're doing like equity justice consulting work to now I don't want to say chip away at systemic racism, classism, sexism within not only law schools, but also corporations, law firms, this stuff that they kind of teach us in, diversity 101s, like first, examine yourself, then understand the history, understand the law, and then be an accomplice and try to dismantle some of these systems. You're actually now doing that. So tell us about being a equity justice consultant, and also how do we do some of this stuff that Ibram X. Kendi is talking about of being an anti-racist and taking race neutral laws and procedures and making them actually anti-racist?
Yeah. So there were like 17 questions in there, so you're gonna have to remind me. Like, but like, so how does the consulting piece play into this? I have spent a lot of time over the past 7 years asking myself, A, am I doing what I want to be doing? B, am I having an impact? Right? Like, am I impacting people the way I want to? Am I paying it forward? Am I making it so that like other people from, less financially capable backgrounds can do the same thing I did, right? And also like once they get into these spaces, once they get into these law firms, once they get into like, these, I don't know, financial institutions, like whatever, like, is it going to matter? Like, are they going to like not just get to like be there, but like participate? So that's part of my mindset, I guess, going into these spaces. And, you said something like first interrogate yourself, then like learn some things, like do the history. I actually start with the history. So like, me through the conversations we've had, history, knowing like what came before is so important to me. Why? A, like you should just like know what came before. It's like kind of important, but also this is the history we carry, right? Like as people of color, as like for you, like being like, Jewish, like it's important, like the history. These are the stories of your family members. These are the stories of your people. They're the stories that we think about every day. It's literally what we carry with us. And so I don't think that you can truly show up as an ally or as an accomplice. I don't think you can truly show up and understand, or at least try to understand, without first understanding what we're carrying, right? Like you can't engage fully and meaningfully if you don't try to engage with the history. And that's why I always start with the history. And I know some people think it's boring and some people are like, I don't care, but you should care, right? Like you should care about other people's history because that informs their lived experience. That informs their trauma, that informs, how you're going to interact with them, what their children are going to learn. I learned the stories of my dad and my mom and my grandparents, right? That's our history. So for me, that's really important. And that informs all of my consulting work that I do, right? So if I go into a company and I'm building a consulting plan, like you better believe there's going to be some history in there. We might talk about microaggressions, but we're going to talk about the history of the term. We're going to talk about the Black psychiatrist who developed it. We're going to talk about why. We're going to talk about like why that's important and why things hit different if you're of color, right? It's the history. It's that piece. So I feel like it's also kind of this transfer, like what I'm doing in the consulting world, which, to be completely transparent, like I think I've said this to you, I almost feel guilty about like making a living now off of the inherent and continued racism that exists in this country. But I also feel like I am like trying at least to do good work that is very needed. But, I think this is kind of a continuation of what I just said about law school and how I feel like I am working from the inside out to like de-institutionalize racism in a lot of ways. When you're having a meeting with the C-suite and you're having a CEO of a company, and this has like happened, calling you and saying like, I literally had never thought about that. before. When you have a Black attorney who works with like one of the biggest corporations in this country who called you in to do like, anti-racism consulting essentially for a mediation, saying to you, I had never thought about this from an intersectional lens. I never thought that this woman is not just a woman, but is also Black, and that the Blackness and the womanness are uniquely interacting to like inform her. And this is, a Black man saying this. When you have those moments, you realize like you're actually having an impact on the way that people are thinking about these things. And hopefully the way they're thinking about these things is going to change how they're communicating about these things, how they're behaving interpersonally moving forward. So that's really, what I'm getting at. It's the human component. I think your like third question of like 10 in this run up was the anti-racism piece, right? Like how do we, for those of you who've read Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which amazing book, super accessible as far as like really getting at the heart of these issues. How do we get at the anti-racism piece and what's important here? He says essentially like the interpersonal is not that important, which I have a bone to pick with him, but that's like for another time. He says policy change is really what we should be focusing on. And yes, he is right. We should be focusing on policy change. If we want these race neutral laws that have had a non-race neutral impact, right? That have had a really negative impact, or these policies, tax structure, gerrymandering, right? Like who gets to like vote in what districts, that sort of thing. If we want these things to change, we need to impact policy change. But I would contend, how do we do that? We get people to care about the policies, right? And you can't do that without having conversations with people. You can't do that without showing, right? Not just telling, showing the CEO, showing the lawyer, showing the professor, this is how this impacts me and this is why you should care, right? This impacts you too. This impacts your kids. This impacts your company's bottom line. We would all love to live in this like, fairy tales and rainbows and like glitter and butterflies world where like people just out of the goodness of their heart are like, let's be anti-racist. Like, let's do that now. That's not how things work. This is all rooted in power and privilege, right? People don't want to just like cede power. Why would they? They don't want to just like give you their money. They don't want to like give you their nice house. They don't like, they like driving their G-Wagon, like whatever, right? We need to convince people. We need to convince people that this is worth their time. And whether you like that or not, like it's true. And I think that what I'm doing is trying to convince people that this is worth their time.
Yeah, but you're fighting against this kind of gravitational pull of capitalism, and it's a difficult hill to climb. And in some of the conversations we have, it's like they think this is a new issue, and it's like European people in Europe like were predominantly white for a long time, and they still found ways to like hate on each other and kill each other and have like class differences and like, whatever, the Irish are bad, and Jonathan Swift like, let's eat the Irish babies and all this type of thing as satire. I mean, so I guess I'm trying to say this is nothing new, but it's weird that like certain white folks in America are like, wow, this is like, we can't be like Scandinavia, and you've talked about Sweden and your mother. We can't be like that because we're multiracial and we're so different here and blah 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 blah. My question is, for someone who's watching and is maybe not as seeped in this literature as you are, where do they start? And then on a more advanced level, for someone who is steeped in this literature, how do we keep pushing?
Start with yourself. Learn some things, right? Like get steeped in the literature, like read, really read and exercise doubt objectivity. Doubt that you are in fact anti-racist, doubt that you are in fact not privileged. I think if even someone like me from a racial minority group who is a woman can doubt my own I guess positionality with respect to this, if I can say I know I'm privileged, I know that like I am imperfect, I know that I have things to learn, I know that I can be classist, I can be sexist, I know that I can be racist. You can do it too, right? And I think that's really important, is to doubt that you're coming to this as like a perfectly formed anti-racist neutral party. Think about the baseline, right? It's like this term that Kim Crenshaw used to just like hammer it into us in law school, the baseline, the baseline, the baseline, right? The baseline isn't neutral. What we're told is fair. How did we get here? Who made the rules? Like, why are we assuming that this is fair? What's the podcast from, I think it's the New York Times, about the white school system, like Good White Parents or something like that.
Yes, something like
that. A friend just like asked me about it, and I was like, oh, I should listen to this. I was like listening to it literally this morning. And I think it's really interesting. Like, a lot of these people like assumed that they were coming to like this neutrally, coming to like the desegregation party neutrally. And then, they were writing letters to their congresspeople like in the 1960s, and they were like, Brown v. Board's great, like, woo, like party time, right? Like, let's desegregate. And like some of them even moved from the suburbs to the city, and then they didn't send their kids to the desegregated schools. Why? They went to these schools and they were like, oh, like, this is chaotic. Like, how are these kids speaking? They seem uneducated, right? Like, they didn't realize cultural difference exists, and we assign value to it, even though we shouldn't. Like, we see difference and we say less than or better than, which that's a whole nother thing. But they were also forgetting that the reason we needed to desegregate, like the reason we got here, is because separate but equal wasn't equal. And so like the education that students were getting was differential based on what schools they were going to. They were assuming a neutral baseline. They were assuming we can send our Black kids and white kids to school together and it's going to be great for everyone, not realizing that like we were coming to the party dressed differently because we had different amounts of money when we got sent to the store to buy our clothes to come to the party, right? And so I think that, like, doubt the baseline, doubt your own objectivity and neutrality, assume that your information is faulty and incomplete, and assume that you're biased. We're all biased in so many ways, If you don't believe me, take the implicit association test, go online, take the IAT. It's the best measure that we have available of our implicit biases. This is a Harvard created test. Harvard's a name that people trust for whatever reason. Go take that test, right? This has better predictive capacity than whether or not you're going to get lung cancer from smoking cigarettes scientifically. Go take the test and see where you lie on the implicit bias, field. I'm sure you'll be surprised. Doubt your objectivity, doubt your lack of bias, doubt your neutrality, and do some research, do some reading.
I love that. Nice white parents.
There we go. Nice white parents. Yeah, good white parents. Nice white parents. Fascinating. Highly recommend listening.
Yeah, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot. Just like some family members talking about growing up in the Crenshaw area and almost nostalgizing, like, yeah, it was like there was black kids and Japanese kids and Jewish kids, and like everyone like played together and it was cool. And I was like, awesome. And then what happened? It's like, oh well, like, we wanted to move to the West Side and also white flight. No, it's like different because it's like, no, it's white flight, and it's like this gravitational pull of the kind of the ladder climbing of the American capitalist dream, which is also on the flip side, American capitalist nightmare for other people. I love the work you're doing, and it's like it's like you're fighting against gravity because people have been fed these terrible, terrible narratives. And so, this was a watershed year for many reasons, but also for, I think, like certain white folks to start thinking about police brutality, Black death, the whole nine. A critique of diversity consulting work would be, well, these corporations are like manifestations of white supremacy and white wealth hoarding. How you're just putting a Band-Aid on these things. What can we do as race conscious folks when it comes to corporations to make it more equitable?
A few things. So one, I think you're right. There's a lot of critiques of diversity consulting. I've critiqued diversity consulting. I've thought about whether or not this work can actually be impactful. And part of how I've addressed this is exactly what we talked about prior, is I think I'm doing diversity consulting a bit differently by leading with history. And honestly, by showing up as a woman of color doing diversity consulting. There are very few women of color, and not to toot my own horn, but toot, very few women of color with critical race studies backgrounds who are attorneys doing this work. I think I have a pretty good knowledge base with respect to legal, systemic, structural systems of racism and identity formation. And that changes the way that I navigate these issues and the way that I have conversations with people about these issues. I think a lot of the diversity consulting work that has been done previously is this like kind of kumbaya, like let's like sit around a table, hold hands and talk about microaggressions. And like, that's part of it, sure. Like, let's talk about it, but like, you need to confront like the boogeyman to do this stuff. You have to actually like sit face to face with your own, you know, just mess to get into this. And that's how I start all of these sessions. It's like, here's some history. And also like, this is not going to be fun or comfortable. So like giddy up. Right. So, you know, I think that's kind of, you know, part one of this. And remind me of, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I mean, I forget their names, but there were some very influential like CEOs, Black men, who coined this like op-ed pieces that are like, here are the steps that corporate America needs to take, not only recruiting more folks of color, disabled folks, like LGBTQ plus folks, but having what do they call it? Pathways to rising up in the institution, and then also changing board of directors and doing the whole thing. Like, I guess for the person that critiques the work that we do, like, hey, that's just Band-Aid work. How do you actually change a law firm or a business? I mean, are they right? Are they right that you have to make pathways to promotion? Are they right that you have to change the board of trustees, board of directors? Like, what's a good way to change these institutions?
So two things. Yes, absolutely, they're right. Representation matters. It matters to see someone who looks like you in the room, and it matters to have someone who shares your background in the room if you have any chance of getting that job, right? So having people from diverse backgrounds, and it's not just like the, you know, carrying other people along because they're from your identity group, it's a shared cultural experience. And that gets to my second point, which is we need to do some serious work and interrogation at these companies and at educational institutions everywhere about like what culture is valuable and what is merit and what is intelligence, right? You know, I had a conversation at a big company that I'm doing some work with recently about, you know, like what is intelligence and like, how do we measure that? Like, what's professionality? There's a lot about like what people should look like, how they should wear their hair, how they should talk, which accents are acceptable. And we really need to interrogate, like, who told us that someone with a Southern accent can't be smart? Like, why can't someone who speaks Ebonics also be intelligent? Like, I don't where's the, like, I don't get it, right? Because we were told that like speaking in a very white manner is what's smart. That approximates education, right? That's something we were told. That's not like some truth. Like, that's not a universal truth. It's something we decided to put value in. So we need to question, like, what are we deeming valuable? What are we deeming smart? And like, what types of, you know, minoritized and marginalized backgrounds are we valuing? Because even when we're bringing in, you know, Black people to companies, brown people to companies, and we're putting them in the C-suite, which is not happening nearly enough, by the way. What types of Black people are we bringing in? Are we only taking people from the top 20 institutions that we deem legitimate? Why aren't we looking at HBCUs? Why aren't we looking at other smaller schools? Why don't we value different types of educational background? Because this isn't just about having different races represented, having different socioeconomic backgrounds represented. This is about like broader difference. And that should be valuable to all of us because that's the world we live in, right? We live in a country of 340 million people in the United States, and people come from a vast array of backgrounds, and there's value in all of them. And I think we really need to question, like, why is it that we only have Ivy educated CEOs? Why is that the only valuable, background educationally to have that leads you to the C-suite? I just, that to me, that's a really real question. And I think we kind of need to like do some unpacking of what's the baseline again, right? Like, where did this value system come from? Who made it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have some thoughts on who might have made it, So I think to answer your question, sure, yes, let's get Black and brown people, let's get LGBTQIA people, let's get people from, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, let's get people who have all sorts of different disabilities, whether they're like, neural or otherwise. Like, yes, let's diversify, let's do that. But let's also like think about how we're valuing humans. Let's think about like what is intelligence and why, and who we really want represented in the room. Like, we don't just need a whole bunch of like Harvard educated Black people in the room. Like, that's not gonna change anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of Verna Myers, who's the like chief diversity officer for Netflix, who says diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is actually the dance. And I kind of borrow from Dr. Defina Lazarus Stewart, and he says, who owns the dance hall? So what we're trying to do is change cultures in these kind of effed up institutions that are not only based on white supremacy, but every day enact it over and over again. The Ivy League stuff, the speak properly and all this type of thing. How do you change who runs the dance hall? When I heard this terrible statistic on the radio that like white men under the age of 35 have 220% more wealth accumulation than Black women under the age of 35. And after COVID, that's going to be even worse. Like, how do you change who owns the dance hall?
I mean, I feel like that's the like $1 billion question, right? If I had the answer to that, I'd have like the magic, the silver bullet for anti-racism and like whatever. But I mean, I think a lot of this is about like choices and about value systems. We have choices where we put our money. Right. Like, we have real choices where we put our money. Like, we don't have to keep giving money to racist banks whose CEOs decide to take to the airwaves and say, oh, there's not enough qualified Black people to hire. Like, maybe let's not give them our money. Like, how about that? Oh, really? Like, I guess I'm not qualified to spend money at your bank either. Mm-hmm. I just, let's make good choices about who we are choosing to invest in. And I also think, honestly, and I apologize to anybody positionally, like, where I am, like us, like in our like mid 20s to like early 40s, we need to make choices about like who we're going to let the ladder down for. Like, who are we going to pull up behind us? Who are we going to bring with us? I just made the leap into being self-employed, which is like during a pandemic, which we can talk about like my mental health later. But part of why I did that was like, I am tired of like my mental resources and like my, what I'm giving into society being controlled by another institution. Like, I want to control like my own worth. I want to control like where I am putting my, thought power. And I want to control my own narrative. Mm-hmm. And the narrative of, for me, people of color, for women of color, I want to control the narrative. And I think that's really important. And again, I think we need to realize this is not going to happen overnight, right? Like, we're not going to dig out of this hole overnight. What we can do is build the structures to hopefully, if we don't kill the environment, in like 150 years, in 200 years, to be in a much better position than where we are today, right? This is incremental. And I know people hate hearing this, but like, America's racist, is going to stay racist. Like, Derek Bell was right. Racism is permanent because it has power, because it's linked to money, but we can make it like less racist. We can make it incrementally less racist. We can make it less profitable to be racist in this country. Mm-hmm. If it is less profitable to be racist in this country, you know what? people are going to stop doing it. You know, this is all linked to power and money, to, you know, all of the things that that gives people. And I think that we need to build the structures. We need to do it intentionally. We need to be intentional about where we're putting our energy and our resources, whether it's banks, whether it's who we're bringing on to work with us. You know, I am being really intentional about, like, I'm not going to not work with white people. I'm half white, right? But I'm being intentional about sourcing people to work with who are of color, who are from other non-conforming and marginalized backgrounds. I'm investing my resources in them the same way this country has invested its resources time and time again in only white men, right? So I think that's part of it. Intentional investment of resources, whether it's who you're buying from or who you're hiring. I think that's, you know, part of what needs to happen here.
Yeah, you just went somewhere, and I was there with you, because what is that Derek Bell quote?
Which one? There are a lot.
No, you were saying that, like, not making racism profitable.
Yeah,
Right.
we need to divest
Yeah.
from racism. And I mean, part of that's like just like telling people how it's already not profitable. I mean, we're losing money. And like, this is a whole nother thing. You know, this is something I hyper focus on, is like voting against interest, and like, you know, Black people who vote against their own interest, poor white people who vote against their own interest. Part of it's just like knowledge, like knowing that it's against your own interest, but part of it's also like literally taking the profit out of doing racist things. Like, we need to make that no longer work to fill people's pockets.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's like easy, but I think we need to draw the line clearly between racism and profitability, between racism and power. We really don't like talking about like white supremacy. It's like the dirtiest word, or like racism or white privilege in this country, because it makes people uncomfortable. But we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about how it's been ultra profitable for this country. And if we do that, if we tie, you know, the link, make the links, draw the causal connections between this country being founded on slavery because it made us money, right? And, you know, all of the other colonial enterprises doing the same thing, and how that has moved forward from, I don't know, slavery into, you know, Black codes, into, you know, sharecropping and forced labor, into chain gangs, into mass incarceration. If we have that conversation, if we talk about, hey, we're going to talk about this because this is what this country is built on and it's made us money, we can unpack that, and we can figure out how to you know, divert resources into other things and make racism not profitable for this country anymore. And there's a lot of ways to get at that, right? It's the carcerative state, it's education, it's a lot of different things. But, you know, I think we really have this kind of myopic view in the United States, like we can only do one thing at once. Like, we can't like do multiple things. We need to figure out all the points of weakness and all the ways to attack systemic and structural racism and the funding of it in this country, and do them all at once. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, no, that, I mean, we got to wrap up soon, but what you were saying reminds me that, like, Black folks fought for their liberation, not to then go enslave white people and put them through the same like trauma and hundreds of years of enslavement. Like, yet there is still this like white fear of like, okay, yeah, like reparations sounds great, but like, what am I gonna have to give up? Like, what's gonna happen with my stuff?
Yeah.
And like even for like poor white folks that like don't really have that much, there's some of them are still like, well, like, we got to do it fair and balanced here. But I think the more, you know, I talk with you, and the more we're doing this work, it's like you can get certain folks with like shame and guilt, which I think actually does do a really good job for some people. Because just by reading a history book, if you read a history book and you don't have some shame and guilt, there's like something wrong with this person. So the shame and guilt part, and like historical unpacking, right? Cicero says those who don't study history always remain children. But also, if you don't get them with the shame and the guilt and the history, capitalism, right? It's more profitable to to get on the train with, get off the Trump train and get on the train of not diversity, because diversity is like 1990s stuff, but like on this kind of justice train, because it's actually more profitable if you are including everybody in this thing. And I'm not just talking about like the woke capitalism thing. Like we really can change how Nike operates, how Microsoft operates in order to make it more equitable for folks. But I can hear Joe's voice in my head wanting us to bring it back to education. So I'll ask you this.
Mm-hmm.
For the K through 16 educators who are listening, is there advice that you would give them in terms of, hey, do more of this in your classroom? Hey, do more of this.
Talk about race. Talk about identity. Talk about marginalization. Talk about oppression. Talk about minoritization. Talk about it early and often, and talk about the real history. Talk about the Trail of Tears, right? Talk about how there were, thousands upon thousands of Indigenous people here in real cities prior to white people stepping foot on our shores. Talk about the intentionality of this project and talk about it early. These are things that we are not taught in elementary school in any real way. We're not taught in high school in any real way, and create spaces for critical thinking around these issues. Teach kids to critically think and to question. Even you as a teacher, the best teachers I have had really encouraged and engaged with kids like me who are like, wait, but no, that's not right. Where are you getting the information that you're teaching us from, right? Like encourage that. It's going to make you a better teacher also. Encourage kids to push back and teach the real history and create spaces for the tough conversations. Like if you don't have a parent calling you mad that you taught, their kid about, I don't know, Congolese people having their arms amputated by like colonial superpowers, then like you're not doing your job. You should have parents calling you upset that you are teaching their kids real history. And that you are encouraging real conversations, because that is where growth happens and that's where change occurs. No one's going to move. No one's going to change if we're all just sitting here being comfortable.
Yeah, no, that's real. Push past that discomfort and actually get into the nitty gritty of it, because that's how we grow. We got to wrap up, but one thing also that I want to thank you for is sometimes when I have these conversations, like I don't know if I'm always seen, but there's something about when we talk like about Jewish history, and you've done the work yourself, and like oftentimes I don't like to talk about myself and my stuff because I feel like, oh, maybe I'm just centering whiteness or maleness or whatever. But when we talk about comparative genocide, like you're like, no, like if you talk about history in an interconnected way, it was Black men that were going to Buchenwald and like liberating white Jews. And then those Black men came back to America and were like, we were treated like kings in Europe, and now you're treating us like garbage here. And we talk about the role of, American Jews and are they working with communities of color, and what about Jews of color? And we talk about these intricacies. And something I really appreciate about you is your lens is very expansive, and maybe it's because of the Philly connection, like ethnic whites and Italians, but there's your critical race lens is so encapsulating of all different stories. I think you hit people at all different angles, so everyone is interested in getting on board with what you're talking about, and I think that's a real strength.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I have to say, don't forget also that Nazi Germany borrowed Jim Crow laws in creating the Nuremberg laws, which is like nuts. It's nuts. Like we think of these as two completely discrete time periods, two completely different places. And that's like another thing you asked, like, what do I encourage educators to do? Connect the dots historically, geographically across the globe. because all of these things were not happening in silos. They were happening in an interconnected way. World leaders were talking to one another. GIs were traveling around the world and, really interrogate what the entire world project, the global project was.
You were just reading a book about that.
I was, yeah. I honestly, I have so many books, I can't even remember the names of most of them. I just got this new book. It was from Isabel Wilkerson in not Cast. Cast, her new book. She did a lot of research on this specific book that talks about the borrowing of Jim Crow in, Nazi era Germany. Fascinating, because you never, they're really, we don't connect those time periods in our heads. It's the Holocaust is something that happened in people's heads, I think hundreds of years ago. And it's no. That happened relatively recently. And it was happening at the same time that apartheid was picking up steam in South Africa, and the United States was really getting nice and comfy with Jim Crow. They were really getting in there. So I just, you've got to think about, how do those things interact with one another? We borrowed our own American, anti-whiteness being extended to Jewish people from that era. It's just, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. You sent me this Hitler's American Model by James Whitman.
There we go.
The U.S. and the Making of Nazi Race Law. Yeah, James Whitman, Hitler's American Model. Yeah, and we'll wrap up in a minute, but exactly what you say. If you were, a black person in the South, you couldn't marry a white person, and so the Nazis were like, "That's a great idea. If you're a Jewish person or a Romani person, you can't marry an Anglo Christian." And also, we're discussing now, and I wish K through 16 educators would do this in the classroom of, we're talking about DACA, we're talking about build that wall, all this stuff. But, you were no longer counted as a whole person, right? You were no longer a full citizen if you were a black person in the South. And then the Nazis took that and said, that's a great idea. You're no longer a citizen if you're a Jew, and we're going to write a big fat J on your passport so everyone knows. And if you're a woman, your middle name becomes Sarah, even if it's not. And if you're a man, your middle name becomes Israel. Mm-hmm. And then we can easily put you in a camp where you wear the yellow star and all these types
of things. I mean, apartheid era South Africa borrowed that from Nazi Germany, right? So it's we export this knowledge from Jim Crow South to, Nazi era Germany, Austria, whatever. They exported to South Africa, who also has pass laws. They force, the black people to carry on passes. And I think the other really interesting thing is we think about the Holocaust as one of the worst things that has ever happened, which it very much is. What's fascinating about the borrowing of Jim Crow laws in Nazi era Germany is they were these laws go too far. They're too harsh. So they actually kind of, diluted them a bit. They were oh, this is too much even for us. So it's just insane to really wrap your head around just the depth of the depravity, the idea of this borrowing of the worst parts of our history and culture. And it was shared. We really like to put, certain people, whether, whoever it is, these world leaders who we hate, who we vilify, up on the hatred pedestal, right? Which they should be. We should hate them. We should vilify them. But don't forget they didn't do it by themselves. Mm-hmm. Hitler wasn't just this is a great idea, everybody follow me. And they were yeah, no, it was other world leaders supported him. They literally sent people here to sit in on congressional. Yeah, it was a whole orchestrated thing. Again, racism globally in the United States, intentional, systematic project. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I hope the folks that are listening, it is systemic, right? Listen to what Daedra is saying. There are concerted efforts, and neoliberalism didn't magically just spread throughout the world. This, governments are saying this stuff works, broken windows theory, Rudy Giuliani is America's mayor. Now we obviously know what black and brown folks in New York have known for a long time of who Rudy Giuliani really is. But I think there's this notion of, if I am just a good white person, I don't call people the N-word, I try to be nice to everybody, everything is going to be good at the end of the day. And what Daedra is saying is no, like that. That's not what we're trying to do here, because it's too big. These policies and procedures need to be changed, and everybody has different access of power, and we need everybody on board, wherever they're at in this really effed up caste system, to be anti-racist, be anti-classist, be anti-sexist, and start doing the work. And that's why I really love that you're on the show today. And I'm like looking for, I just walked by one of those temples yesterday that you were saying you might do a workshop with, and I'm excited to work with you possibly on that. And so I love your vision. I love the work that you do. I'm a big fan of yours.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of yours too. Because with ways. Yeah. And I have to say, I know we're out of time, but I have to say, just because of what you just said, I think a really good way to think about this is, you know, for white people who are like, either I didn't contribute to this, or like, I'm a good person, like I'm not like actively racist. Sure, like that is wonderful. But like, think about the fact that marginalized and oppressed people, they didn't do anything to get marginalized and oppressed. They were born into it. It's kind of this like idea of like hooking like rights and responsibilities, right? You know, you have a responsibility to help unoppress, because the same way that you like aren't doing anything to like, you know, necessarily make things worse, like you're not doing anything to make it better either for the people who are just born into this, who are carrying all the weight. Share the weight, right? Share the burden, like help us carry it, because it's heavy and we've been carrying it for like a really, really long time by ourselves, right? Like actively do something. We have to actively engage. That's it. That's
mic drop. Callback, that's your critique of the interpersonal of Kendi, which he's not doing. Because yes, it's the policy and procedure, which of course we got to change. But you're saying, if you're just a, let's say, white person or Asian person, whatever, walking through the world race neutral, that's actually not enough, right? You're not carrying the burden, and you're not distributing.
I would also posit there is no such thing as race neutral, right? That's the baseline question. There is no race neutral. You being race neutral is forwarding racist, structural, and systemic policies, because it's not race neutral for me. Like I'm still, as a woman of color, it's not race neutral for, you know, the Southeast Asian person who isn't faring as well as the person who's Japanese American, or, you know, from a more favorable Asian race. Like it's only race neutral for you because of your privilege. That's the work of white privilege. It neutralizes, it invisibilizes. It invisibilizes the burden. It makes weightless the burden that the rest of us who don't live in that race neutral world that doesn't actually exist, it doesn't, you know, we're still carrying that weight, right? There is no race neutral. Like just like wipe that from our shared vocabulary. Race neutral is not a thing, right?
Right. And lastly, like when people hear white privilege or white supremacy, one of my big wishes in the world is not to have that met with defensiveness and dissecting. Well, Daedra, like, isn't that kind of like too much? Like, what do you really? Instead of defensiveness, have white supremacy and white privilege met with, holy shit, what can I do? How can I help? Where should I start?
Yeah.
And I think if people do, the world would be so different if that was the answer.
Yeah. And that's part of it. Like, how do we figure that piece out? How do we disarm people? How do we get them to sit at the table and have the conversation, right? And that's part of my critique of Kendi, is these interpersonal relationships, these conversations matter, because we need to get people to not feel as though they're being aggressed upon. We need to, you know, sure, you're gonna have to give up some privilege, you're gonna have to give up some of the unearned benefits, but like, how do we make it feel as though like we're not blaming you, we're just asking you for help, right? Like, can we do this as a shared communal thing?
And those people's lives would probably be better if they embrace.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This was amazing. You're amazing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, this is beautiful. The CWI Community Works Institute Spotlight Series continues. Joe Brooks is interviewing folks on Friday. I'm interviewing folks on Sunday. you know, I'm biased. I think my folks are cooler, but tune into both of them. It's all good. The more the merrier. Thank you all for tuning in.